good morning.
Hello, Nicola.
Chair, the live feed is up and running.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Audit and Corporate Governance Scrutiny Committee. So item 1, apologies for absence, please.
Just apologies from Councillor Rowe, Chair.
Thank you. Any other apologies? If not, we move to item 2, declarations of interest. Members are requested to declare the existence and nature of any disclosable pecuniary interest and or other interest not already on their register of interests in any item on the agenda and withdraw from the meeting at the appropriate time. Item 3, minutes of the last meeting held on the 2nd of December 2020. They have been circulated, so can we have a proposer, please, that they are a true and accurate record?
Yes, Chair,
Thank you,
propose.
Councillor Armitage. Do we have
I'll
a seconder?
second, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Shipman. All in favour? Thank you. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had a majority there. Thank you. That is carried. So item 4 then, we move to a presentation from Arlingclose, our Treasury advisors. So we're over to you, please.
Including next Thank
you very much, Chair. Hopefully you can see our, hopefully everybody can see the slides. Just to confirm, how long are you expecting the presentation to go on for today?
We thought 3 hours. No, I'm joking. 15 minutes, 15, 20 minutes. I think, and I'm sure there will be questions. So I think if that's all right with the committee.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's going to be very, very quick then. So we're going to have to get cracking. So okay. So just a bit of background. Basically, we are your Treasury Management advisors. So we're called Arlingclose. We've been your advisors for a number of years now. We basically advise you on all Treasury-based matters. So everything from accounting to your investment policy to when to time your borrowing, whether you need to borrow externally at all. So we sometimes, I'm sure, at some point you'll be receiving your Treasury management strategy and your Treasury and also your capital strategy to scrutinise, and also at full council you'll be looking to vote on those as well and pass those. And so a lot of those, it's all to do with the authorities' investments and debt. So just moving very, very quickly. So, well, what is Treasury Management? Well, the Chartered Institute of Public Financial Accountancy, who are CIPFA, have a definition, and that is it's the management of the organisation's investments and cash flows, its banking, money market and capital transactions, the effective controls of the risks associated with these activities, and the pursuit of optimum performance consistent with those risks, which is a very, very wordy way of saying it's managing your money, your cash. Obviously, you understand that these things have a relationship with the budget, but this is managing the physical cash. So the expenditure, the banking, making sure that you can make payments when you need to, when you've got cash on hand, being able to invest that cash, and when you need to borrow money, that you're able to borrow it. So I'm just going to skip very quickly. So most of you will be experienced councillors and will be aware and will have the questions of, well, why do we need to borrow, and why do we have cash to invest? Every year we pass a balanced budget, and perhaps there'll be a little bit of money put in reserves or a small amount of money drawn from reserves. So why do we have these investments anyway? Well, you may have, grants, council tax fees and charges coming in, but there'll be a mismatch between when that expenditure goes out. So those salaries and goods and services, etc. So because of that mismatch, that creates investment balances. That creates your short-term investments. If over a number of years you build up reserves, whether that's earmarked for some purpose or cash put aside for a rainy day, that will also increase your investments. In the longer term, any investments that you have are all generated from either cash flow, i.e. working capital, or by your reserves. Equally, your borrowing, you may have to borrow short term to manage short-term liquidity needs in the year, but the only thing that drives your long-term borrowing should be your capital program, i.e., capital expenditure, investments in fixed assets, in long-term on assets that provide the authority and therefore the local area with benefits for more than a year. And in statute, the only reason you can borrow is for long-term assets. Very, very quickly, you have an extremely broad range of powers. You can basically, within the legislative and the regulatory framework, in law, you can invest or borrow money for any purpose relevant to your activities and for your prudent financial management. And the local allows you to do anything that individuals may do. So you have an extremely broad range of powers. However, the MHCLG and the Secretary of State also has a wide range of powers, and they are able to set borrowing limits upon you, issue regulations, guidance, or directions. So though you have in statute a very, very wide range of powers, you also do, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on your view, have to do what MHCLG tells you. The only real inviolate rule, though, in local authority treasury management is that the local authority itself, so you, must set an affordable borrowing limit, and you must stick to it. So if you see on the local authorities must, the first one is setting an affordable borrowing limit. So that's your authorised limit. And that's something that the whole council has to pass. You can't delegate it down to anybody else. And then once you've set it, you can't exceed it. So that is, it's nobody, unless you are put into special measures, or unless you are, or some other extreme circumstance, MHCLG will not be putting a borrowing limit on you, and they haven't done for many years. It is down to you as councillors to decide the amount of external debt you believe that the authority can safely carry and that can prudently carry. Treasury management, to be honest, this is relatively self-evident. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but capital expenditure, so the thing that drives your borrowing, should be prudent, affordable, and sustainable. So prudent meaning, it's normal language, really, that it should meet service needs and provide value for money. Affordable in that you can afford it with acceptable council tax levels, and sustainable over the long term. The other side of the coin, of course, is your investments, and SIP for a gain requires you to put your priority on security, so making sure you get your money back from your investments, and liquidity, which means you can get your money back when you need it. Once you've made sure that you've managed the risks of security and liquidity, you're also supposed to try and get yield. So the return that you get from your investments should be commensurate with the risks you're taking. But bear in mind that an authority like yourself that is trying to make sure that you're being very secure and very liquid, returns are going to be extremely low under the current interest rate situation. So again, quickly, what is your role as elected members? Well, hopefully you've got a broad idea of what the role of the council is. But I think the most important thing on this slide, and if you're struggling to sleep this evening, I'm sure you can read through these slides in greater detail. But the thing I want you to focus on right now is that challenge where appropriate. I'm sure you're all aware that interest rates are extremely low. If Jane and her finance staff were able to be getting you huge, exciting investment returns, that is a reason to challenge, because your role as elected members is not to choose individual investments, your role, financial investments anyway, or to try and time specific loans being taken out. Your job is to set the framework in which the officers work under, and the officers can't break that framework. So if you say, we want you to do these sorts of things, they can only do those sorts of things. And the book really stops with you. And so that's why it's so important to challenge where appropriate decisions that have been made, and ensuring that they're being made within the framework that the wider council has set. I think probably a skip past those, considering our time constraints, and go straight on to your current plans. So if we look at the big question, which is North East Derbyshire going to be a borrower or an investor over the next couple of years? Are you going to need to borrow money over the next few years? Well, this looks like a very complicated slide, but I can promise you it's not. This is basically just an idea of, well, what is driving your borrowing and investment decisions? So the first line here is your loan capital financing requirement, and we basically just put into a model your current plans. So your CFR is your underlying need to borrow. The best way to think about it is it's all of the assets that you've bought in the past that you're yet to pay for, because you're spreading that cost over time. You financed those, or you funded those assets in a mixture of external borrowing, where you've gone to external organisations, in your case, mainly central government via the Public Works Loan Board. And you've also used some cash that you had on hand. You've internally borrowed, which is a good thing. It's the safest and cheapest way of borrowing is to spend cash rather than going out and externally borrowing. But most of your external borrowing is historic, and it's to do with your housing. It was to do with housing subsidy reform, where the council went through housing subsidy reform, and you were required, rather than going from the old subsidy regime, we went to self-financing. And as part of that, you were required by central government to take on, I think it was off the top of my head, around 150 million pounds. So the majority of that is housing related debt. So if we then project forwards and look at the situation as it is now first, you've got underlying capital expenditure that you need to repay of 180 million. You've borrowed from central government or other local authorities, 150 million of that, and you've spent 33 million pounds of your own money to finance that capital expenditure. And so once we take into account your reserves, so money you've put aside, and working capital surplus, you had at the end of the last financial year, around 26 million pounds worth of cash. If we project forward your plans, all else being equal, we can see your capital financing requirement increasing to 188 million as you make more capital expenditure, and then that amount reducing over time as you repay that CFR, as you take money out of the budget in order to repay debt, because you have a statutory requirement to do so. And you can see that starts to fall. So by 2024, debt has started, your underlying need to borrow has fallen to under 180 million. Now, the impact on that bottom line on the situation for the council is that means all else, assuming all of these plans stay the same, which I can pretty much guarantee they won't, and just assuming that all of these plans happen exactly as you expect them to, which I can also guarantee they won't, you should have investments of falling down to 17 million in 2022, and then rising up again to around 23 million in 2024. But as I said, these things, this is just a projection. This just gives us a good idea of which way the wind is blowing. They're all subject to change. And so if the council was to change its capital plans and decide to invest further in the local area, and therefore invest more and spend more money and need to borrow more money, or if the council was to spend some of those usable reserves, your investments would fall. So if your plans change, the projections will change. And that's another important role, or another important element of the scrutiny you're going to be putting on these plans is, well, at the moment, the answer to the question, does North East Derbyshire District Council need to borrow? The answer is no. But if the plans change, and that can change very quickly. So part of the scrutiny that you need to put the Treasury Management under is, well, if I've just looked at this and said, well, according to your plans, you don't need to borrow, and then this time next year, you see that their borrowing was taken out, further borrowing was taken, it's a fair enough question for you to scrutinise and to ask, well, okay, I thought we didn't need to borrow. Why do we take that borrowing out? Now, it could be there was a completely legitimate reason for that. Those legitimate reasons are likely to be our plans changed, or we spent more reserves or we spent reserves for a specific purpose that was agreed by council. There's clear reasons why that may or may not happen, but it's about making sure that the decisions that you're scrutinising make sense within the context of the council. Very, very quickly, I'm just going to hand over to my colleague, Paul. We're just going to talk very quickly about where we think interest rates are going to go to. So at the moment, because as you're going to be net investors, we're expecting you to be anyway, in the interest rate environment is going to have quite a big impact on your on the returns that you can expect. But I'm just going to pass you over to my colleague Paul for a moment.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. So yeah, this is our latest interest rate forecast. The top left chart there is our forecast for the official Bank of England bank rate, with our central forecast being, hopefully you can see it there, the sort of the thicker red line. And as you can see, we don't think that bank rate is going to be going anywhere anytime soon. Obviously, everyone will be aware of what's going in the news, the effect that the pandemic has had on lockdowns and on the various economies around the world. So all central banks have kept interest rates ultra low. And we don't think that that's going to change in the UK anytime soon. The silver or the grey line there that you can hopefully see is what's called the market implied line, and the market sort of believes that there's an outside chance of negative interest rates. We don't think that will happen. There's obviously a chance, but it's not part of our central case. We feel that the Bank of England will keep using quantitative easing before it tries to sort of look at any negative interest rate environments. I mean, there's still 10 basis points that they may cut, but what you can do, what you can at zero that you can't do at 10 basis points remains to be seen. But that's where we think bank rate will stay. So certainly for any short-term borrowing needs, that will be nice and cheap. Unfortunately, the flip side is that any short-term liquidity balances that the authority will be earning next to zero as well. The other charts here, 5, 10 and 20-year gilt yields, that we use them for medium and longer-term borrowing for the authority. And again, you can see that we're expecting the yields to go up slightly from where they are over the next 3 or so years, but not to any great extent, meaning that for clients who have longer term borrowing needs, who want to take some longer term PWLB funding, that there really isn't the rush to jump in and take it. I mean, that's our interest rate forecast in a nutshell. Were there any questions on that at all?
Any questions from anyone?
So in case you can't see your screen, I can't see any indications for questions.
No, thank you. We'll carry on. Thank you.
Thank you. Stephen, did you want to do the borrowing options?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very, again, just looking at time, just to look at sort of the your current portfolio. It's as we discussed, all of your debt currently is taken out from the Public Works Loan Board. You can see that most of it is fixed maturity, which means it's like it's just a straight bullet loan. So you take it out on day one and you repay it all at the end of the term. You do have a small amount of EIP and annuity loans. They are a little bit like a mortgage or a loan that you may take out as an individual. You take it out on day one and then you repay a little bit every year over time. And you can see that the average, because those loans are historical, the rates that you're paying on them are much higher than if you were to take out debt today. So a logical question would be, well, why don't we repay these loans and take out cheaper debt that's available at the moment? Well, unfortunately, central government doesn't like you doing that, and so there's these significant premiums that you would have to pay in order to get out of these loans. And as you can see, in order to pay £150 million of maturity loans back, you need to pay an extra 60 on top of that. So altogether, you'd really have to pay about £210 million to repay 150 million, which doesn't really make a lot of sense. So overall, you've got the debt, you need the debt, so it's best to stick with it rather than trying to refinance it in this interest rate environment. If interest rates were to change and those premiums would change, the cost of you to repay that debt would change, and our advice may be reconsidered. But as things stand, you have quite a long debt portfolio, you need the money, it's probably best to keep that money. So just looking at one quite important element, and that is recently your main lender, the Public Works Loan Board, has changed its lending terms. So previously, the Public Works Loan Board would lend to you for any purpose and really wouldn't ask any questions about those purposes. However, recently, just about 18 months ago, the PWLB announced that it was going to change its policy, and the results of that came through in November. And now, for the Public Works Loan Board to lend to you, any capital expenditure you make has to fall into one of these 5 buckets. So either borrowing that will allow you to undertake service delivery, borrowing that will allow you to regenerate the local area, preventative action, which is a bit of a strange one, but it's basically, you know, if you need to step in to prevent something from happening. Housing, which is a big one, it has its own, it doesn't come under regeneration or service delivery, interestingly, it has its own element because the government thinks it's so important, and also they want you to retain the ability to refinance old debt. What they do not want you to be able to do is purchase investment assets primarily for yield. So all of these things can wash their faces, they all can generate an income, but they can't be, from now on, you can't have anything in your capital program where the main reason you're doing it is to generate income for the authority. So if we were to look at the authority's housing project, some of your housing projects do generate an income over and above what they cost. But because the main reason for doing those things is to generate housing and to give housing to increase the supply of homes in the local area, and to look at your and to support your service delivery of homes in the local area, it's absolutely fine that they generate a yield. The only question is about assets that are designed primarily for a yield, and some of those things, you know, things like where you're not going to be, where you take on land or buildings that aren't in your local area, or you take on land and buildings which you're not really you're purchasing it. It's not, you've not done anything to regenerate the local area. You've just bought an office block in your local area with no real intention of doing anything with it. You're just going to hold it indefinitely. These are the sorts of things that central government don't want you to do. And the problem is going to be that if it's not just they won't lend to you to do those things, they won't lend to you if you're even doing those things yourselves without borrowing for them. So it really chokes off your ability to borrow from the Public Works Loan Board, which is still your cheapest form of long-term borrowing, if you do undertake those. So it's, again, is your role is scrutinising decisions and understanding decisions that the authority is making. And quite a big part of that from now on is going to be understanding, well, are any of our, and bear in mind that your Section 151 officer, so in this case, Jane, will have to sign off whether anything is purchasing investment assets primarily for yield. So, you know, she's got a professional obligation to do that, and there's a requirement for the Treasury for her to sign off your capital programme. So it'll be important for you, when you're scrutinising decisions, to make sure that you as members, when scrutinising the capital programme, understand which of these 5 elements any project falls into, and if it doesn't, and it does fall into purchasing investment assets primarily for yield, what the plan the authority has to fund those investments, because it will cut off your ability to go into the Public Works Loan Board. At the moment, you don't need to do that, but it will cut it off for a 3-year period. So it does reduce your flexibility going forward. So that's a very important thing that you will be scrutinising over the next few years. Are there any questions on this? Because this is obviously quite important, but I am aware of the time. And before we just do a quick bit on investments, I just want to check that there's nothing that anybody would like to a bit more detail on this part, because this is probably the most important thing you're going to be scrutinising over the next couple of months or years.
Chair, just to confirm, there are no indications to speak.
Okay, in that case, we'll just move on to investments. I think if we just quickly, I think probably just quickly look at your where your performance is driven and what drives it, and then I think we can take any final questions. So I'll hand you back over to Paul.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. So this is an example of what the benchmarking slides that we prepare each quarter and then present to the officers every time we meet with them. So it just shows, even though it's not obviously a perfect comparison, and obviously every authority's strategies are slightly different, so you're not always comparing like with like, but it sort of gives a flavour for comparisons across peer groups. So it would be comparisons with English non-met districts, and then also our entire client base. So one of the earlier slides that we did touch on because of time showed that you're a lot more exposed to money market funds in terms of your liquidity balances compared to many of our clients, which we like. They're nice diversified funds compared to something like banks. They're still exposed to bail-in risk. Bank bail-in that we now have, where banks were split into ring-fenced and non-ring-fenced banks after the global financial crisis. So even though that you're still exposed to financial risks, you're more diversified in money market funds, which is why we prefer them compared to the banks. So just in the box here, you can see your comparison with the rest of our client base. You're slightly above the average for bail-in, but again, there's no real need for concern because you are diversified. One way to reduce that would be to invest more in other local authorities where we like their credit risk. Liquidity, your portfolio is focused on short-term liquidity balances rather than any longer-term investment. So all good there. And then just looking at the yield down at the bottom there, and that's sort of borne out in the level of total return and income return that the authority would be earning, which is next to nothing. I mean, as Stephen and I touched on, in the current interest rate environment, there really are no decent short-term investment returns to be had. It's only when you start looking at sort of longer-term investments, it's longer with local authorities or housing associations, or into longer-term pooled funds, that the income returns start to pick up. But that would obviously require a change of strategy from the authority to start looking at those. But yeah, that's.
Can I ask a question of you, Mr. Roberts, with regard to loans to other authorities?
Yes.
You've made reference to that. Is that something that Arlingclose is now advocating in a COVID situation when a large number of local authorities are financially struggling, and we know quite a few that have either declared a Section 114 notice or they are close to doing that? And is that a wise piece of advice that we could be doing that at this current moment in time?
In terms of credit risk, I mean, that's something that the credit risk of local authorities is always something that Arlingclose has been comfortable with, particularly compared to banks. Your ability, if you were to lend to another authority, if it was to get into trouble, you're able to precept that money so that you wouldn't actually lose that money. It may take you some time to get it back, but the likelihood of you losing it is very, very low. Whereas if you were invested in a bank that needed to be bailed out, there's quite a strong chance that you would lose some of that, some of your deposit. So we, in terms of our general advice for local authorities, we're comfortable with them. If there is an authority, Croydon, one that's under a Section 114, we would advise, probably from a political standpoint, to maybe avoid it. But in terms of the general credit risk of the local authority sector, it remains something that we do have money invested.
We do have money invested in Croydon, and they've issued Section 114 notices twice now. So yes, I suppose we could say that they might be good for the money. It might not be now. it could be now, but you're sort of saying it's better than perhaps investing with a bank. So both as risky, one's not as bad as the other. Is that the upshot of it?
It's I suppose different risks. So one in terms of the local authority, the credit risk will be low. The likelihood of them going bust, whereas there's a greater likelihood with a bank, but maybe liquidity risk is maybe slightly high should the authority end up in a section 114 position. But in terms,
I'll be more explicit than Paul. That yes is the short answer. I mean, a local authority, you're protected in legislation that you will be able to go to the High Court and precept. You know, it's in legislation that your money is secured on the revenues of the authority. So even if Croydon was to go completely bust, if a Section 114 notice was to fail, there would be you've got a lot of extremely good protections within legislation. On the other hand, with a bank, you're exactly the opposite way around. The provisions in legislation actually disadvantage you and disadvantage you specifically as a local authority. So I think that if you take Croydon's actually a great example now. When they issued their Section 114 notice, if a local authority had already lent money to them, we've not advised our clients not to break any investments or attempt to break any investments with Croydon because of that protection within legislation. The reason that we would probably advise against Croydon making, well, no, we do advise against new loans to Croydon currently, is simply because, and is another legislative issue, which is that in legislation, once a Section 114 notice has been agreed, an authority can't agree any new expenditure which is not for central and services which are required under statute. So our concern is not that they will not pay you the money back, because they can't not pay you the money back, basically. Our worry is that you may be entering into a contract which is untested, because we don't know whether interest payments, and you'd want interest to be paid, interest payments are allowed under the terms of the Section 114 notice. So that's our main concern. And obviously there is, as Paul put it, sort of those sort of I don't want to say a political, but a public relations and a issue to this as well, which you don't want to be dragged into. But that's sort of it. But I think you hit the nail on the head. Nothing is without risk, but the risks around local authorities are significantly lower than a bank. I think we may have a question, Chair.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions. I was just about to say thank you, Mr. Kitching, for the short answer that was yes, followed by a very comprehensive answer. But I was actually pleased to hear the response. Thank you for that. We've got a question. Is it Councillor Shipman?
Yeah, it was just on what you've just said about it being in statute about our money's protected. Has this ever been tested? Has someone actually ever been served with a Section 114 notice and then a lender have received their money back? Or is this all, we think that's how the system works? Like, what's the position?
So, I mean, that's a really interesting question, in the sense that a number of local authorities have issued Section 114 notices, and none of them have ever defaulted. So none of them have ever not paid the money back. So the Section 114, and I suppose I take a bit of I don't want to say esoteric view, but I take a bit of an unusual view, that I think that Section 114 notices are actually good, because it shows that the Director of Finance, who is the person who issues it, and says no more spending until we're on an even keel, until we can set a balanced budget. It shows that the Section 151 officer is taking their role very seriously, and it shows that the fact that they've done this means that they're on the road to recovery, because somebody's drawn a line in the sand and said, okay, we need to fix this. Whereas if you're a private company, as long as you don't break the Companies Act, you can do whatever you want. You can run your company into the ground if you want. So there's a statutory protection there. So there's obviously the answer, which is, well, no, this has never been tested, because no local authority has ever not paid their money back, even when they've been in a 114 situation. And you take the very extreme example of Northamptonshire, which was in such a situation that required it to be reorganised into new authorities, into new unitary authorities, no lender, no local authority lender, or no lender of any kind lost any money in that either.
Right, thank you. Are there any other questions on this slide? Councillor Armitage? You're on mute.
Right, we're all right now. Yeah, it's this investments with local authorities. I can't see the point of us investing in these people. You know, why can't we spend the money at home rather than helping other people out? You know, there is a risk. You mentioned about things, a lot of theoretical things in your earlier slides, like interest rates. I ran a business once when the base rate went up to 18%. So, you know, I regard people speculating on interest rates with a pinch of salt. Gilts have always been safe. Of course, the safest is gold bullion. But did you advise us to invest with Croydon? And do you actually check these people in the way that a bank does? If you borrow money from a bank, they want accounts, they want one thing and another, cash flows, budgets, and all the rest of it on a fairly frequent basis. I mean, as an investment people, do you check people as, what shall I say, as like a bank would?
Well, we certainly look and do credit analysis on the sector as a whole, and we certainly advised North East Derbyshire to invest in local authorities. So we look at it we look at local authorities on a sector basis. So we don't, but to sort of be specific on Croydon, did we advise you specifically to invest in Croydon? No, but that was within our advice. So certainly not trying to pass the buck on to anybody. It was certainly within the advice that we've given you. Did we look at specific authority? Do we look into specific authorities? Yes, we do a certain amount of analysis into specific authorities, which is available to you. However, we do think that they're all good, and we do still, except in the example of Croydon, now they've done a Section 114 notice, we would still advise you to invest in any local authority besides Croydon at the moment. We do analysis and give, and sort of through our what's called our ideal trade platform, which your officers can go on and see what the rating is before they invest. So we do that sort of analysis, but we don't require authorities for what are relatively short-term loans in the money markets to provide us with things like accounts, because they're already published on the internet and we already have those, or business plans because they're already published on the internet like yours are, and we've already got those. So we don't require them to send us any information, because all of that is already published by local authorities or by central government, and we do use that to build our view together. I think when you ask, well, why are we lending these money and why can't we just spend the money in the local area? Well, that's a decision for the councillors. But whilst you've got money, you do need to do something with it. And if we just go back a couple of slides that we didn't get a chance to look at, the risk to you just sticking it in the bank is extremely high to a local authority, much higher than lending it to another local authority. And it's not specifically high for you as individuals, or for me, or for Paul. Maybe for Paul, because obviously it does affect very rich people. But for normal people like me, or for everybody else, the bank legislation has been changed designed to protect individuals. So these retail depositors up here, whereas down here, shareholders, they're the first people who will lose money. But unfortunately, the next people are local authorities and other organisations like local authorities. So I absolutely understand. It's a decision for the council to make. Or should we have these balances anyway? Shouldn't we be spending the money? But whilst you've got the balances, you need to put them somewhere. And I'd be very, very worried about you sticking them all in banks or sticking them all in individual banks, because the legislation has changed to be so punitive to local authorities.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Armitage. Anybody else with a question on this slide? No, that's it. So can we continue then, please?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just looking at the time. I mean, I think the thing to look at here is, how do you compare? Well, this is just looking at the amount that you're getting back on your investments compared to the amount of risk you're taking. And you can see there's just, in a sensible world, the people taking very, very low risk would be getting very low return, and the people taking lots of risk would be getting lots of return. So you can see there's no relationship here. There's just no relationship whatsoever between the amount of risk you take and the amount of and the amount of return you get. Where there is a relationship is as Paul mentioned before, is the longer of other people who are around the same. And in such a low interest rate environment, the only way that you're able to get a higher return on your investments, if you choose not to spend them, is to invest out for longer periods. Now, the reason that North East Derbyshire hasn't invested out further up to now is because, as you'll all be well aware, there has been a change in the sort of the political makeup of the authority, and what that's led to is decisions on the capital programme, decisions on spending, and whether you're going to still have these investments. And what we don't want you to do, and what the decision was made not to do, was invest money out for a long period of time and then find that you need it. So that's what we didn't want you to do. We wanted you to have some certainty around your plans before you started investing out for a longer period of time. I think you're starting to get that certainty now, and starting to get sort of a bit more of a clear idea of what your capital programme is, what your likely drawdown of reserves are. Obviously, these things are subject to change and subject to the agreement by the councillors, but we do have a broad idea of which way the wind is blowing on this, and that you will have investment balances over the next 3 or 4 years. And so you can start to make decisions where you will invest out for a longer period of time. Yeah, I think I'm just very aware of the time. We said 20 minutes, and we've done half an hour. So, well, actually no, 40 minutes. So I think probably we have got a few more slides, but it's probably best just to leave it there and give you time for any more questions that we have, or I don't know, you've obviously got other things on the agenda after this. So I'll hand back to the chair at this point.
Thank you. So if we can just go back to full screen, then I can see everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you. And then we have got some questions. So Councillor Barker, please.
Cheers, Chair. Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot there, and I know we've been through it before, and the investments and stuff. I'm still trying to get my head around some of the figures, and some of them don't match up with the report that I've read through a couple of times. It's, some of the figures that you've just skidded about how much we've borrowed and how much we've got left at the end of the day. But 188 million we seem to have borrowed. Most of that's for the HRA to pay back the what we borrowed to sort the council houses out. That's fine. But we've got £26 million like in cash at the end, and it might be a recurring theme through this meeting. We've just borrowed £1 million nearly for a project. Why didn't we use some of that £26 million to instead of borrowing it? That's one of my questions, I suppose.
If that's section one of your questions, Councillor Barker, I'll just bring the section 151 officer in to answer that bit.
Yeah,
Jane?
if I may, thank you, Chair. Yes, Councillor Barker, it's the process by which we have to demonstrate for the Treasury Management strategy how we're actually funding a scheme. So although we've said we're borrowing, we're not actually externally borrowing. It will fall into that internal borrowing line. So we're using our balances to fund that. We're not actually going out to the market to borrow anything at the moment because we're holding all of those reserves. So the term borrowing is loose because it means external and internal borrowing.
Okay. I thought it said public work board on that report that I read, but I'll try and dig it up.
It will be internal borrowing. If the report's different, then that'll be my oversight. I apologise. It is borrowing, but it's internal borrowing. It has to.
Okay, thank you. I thought it said public work loan board.
It is borrowing. It's internal borrowing, though.
Yeah, it's part of that 26 million or 23 million that it'll be in 24. Is that
Yes, that's
part of
right.
that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, that's answered that one. I'll leave it at that at this point, Martin. We'll come back, hopefully.
Go in with another question while you've got the floor.
No, I'm all right. It's more on the reports that we'll talk about in a bit.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from anyone? I think from my point of view, I just wanted to, I think that at some point we might, as a audit committee, might have to have a little conversation more about the bank risk and bail-in and ring-fencing information, because looking at the benchmarking information that we've had today from Arlingclose, which I thought was extremely helpful, it's clear that even though you're not particularly worried, it's a little bit higher than benchmarked authorities and other LAs in the country. And maybe it is worth us looking at it, because we know the precarious situation of banks and so on, and particularly the situation that we're in, and maybe just to bring that risk down somewhat, and perhaps a report on bank risk and what else we can do to mitigate it could be helpful. I hope the committee would agree with that. The other one was the investment strategy. I've always talked about this hundreds of times now. And while we know it's not particularly a brilliant time to be investing in some things, I've always talked about an investment strategy that has minimal risk to it, but better than no, so risk adverse that we might as well just be putting money in a shoebox under our beds. And I do feel that as an audit committee, we haven't really addressed this. And I'm just saying to Section 151 officer at some point, perhaps in the working forward plan of our committee, that we do need to address this. The other thing about the loan maturity profile, it's good to see that beyond 2054, things look a lot more positive. So I'm looking forward to talking about that when I'm a councillor in 2054. Are there any other, thank you for that. Are there any other comments or questions from the committee? Do you want to answer that to Section 151 officer, anything, the comments I've just made?
No, happy to do that, Chair. Sorry, everybody, I forgot to turn my microphone on. Yeah, happy to address both of those, Chair. We've done an awful lot of work to move our money away from the banks, as Stephen and Paul will attest to. We were much more highly geared towards the banks this time last year, as you will recall.
Yep.
So that is something that's very much on our radar too. We want to move that away, and we are looking to diversify. We're working with our colleagues at Arlingclose at the moment to start to look at potential housing association investments, which will have a better return and have a longer duration. Yeah. And they're the type of things that we want to diversify into. So more than happy to take those.
Just one point on the bank risk there and the bail-in risk. It's worth saying that because of the amount that the authority is holding in money market funds, even though that's exposed to bail-in risk, the nature of money market funds is that you would be spread across sort of 30 or 40 banks. So rather than you just having invested in Lloyds or Santander, those single name banks that Stephen mentioned earlier, by being in a money market fund, yes, you're still exposed to bail-in risk, but it's spread very, very widely, so that the chances of all of those banks getting into any difficulty is is minimal. So even if there's one, the fact that you're in a diversified fund helps to reduce that credit risk. So there's certainly from our side, and yeah, we've been working with Jane to spread that risk out. So there's certainly no concern from our side that even though that bail-in number was perhaps higher than the average, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have a super risky portfolio.
No, and we accept that, but 85% I will say is still high, and quite a bit above our benchmarked neighbours. So I think it is worth addressing, and thank you for offering to look at that with the Section 151 officer. Councillor Shipman.
Thanks, Chair. I was just wondering, given the fact that we obviously declared a climate emergency not long back, do we make sure that we avoid investing money in fossil fuel industry, etc.? Is that something that we actually make a point of doing?
Section 151 officer, do you want to look at that?
It's not something that I've particularly paid attention to, because the majority of the things are within money market funds, but I will certainly have a look at that for you, Councillor Shipman. Let me take that one away.
The Bank of England has certainly tried to sort of push. There's been a big push on the larger fund managers to to look at those sorts of things, but less focus on the banks. Where at the Mark Carney, the old Bank of England governor, he's been sort of putting pressure on the banks to look at who they're lending to more of what's called an ESG focused, environmental, social, and governance concerns. But that's pressure is coming on that side. But it's
something the committee has mentioned before. We did talk about ethical fund management. You might recall my little quip about the only way is ethics. I think we are mindful of it. So I think it's important that we do consider it. So if we could talk about that at some point, maybe have a briefing about ethical fund management at some point coming to this committee.
Sorry, Chair. I mean, just to jump in. I mean, I'm sorry, my sound went a bit funny. I've had to change microphones. But the as Paul's pointed out, you don't have anything directly into in fossil fuels. However, there's the issues that Paul's pointed out. But we have for other clients looked at sort of we obviously, it's not our place to decide what your ethics are. So we try not to take a view on what is ethical. However, we have done for other clients an analysis of investments and how those investments interact with general ESG principles. So that is something that if we were going to come back and I'm aware that I'm sure that the Democratic Services people will be tearing their hair out as I say this, because that your meetings are very tightly organised. But if you would like us to come back to Audit Committee over the next couple of months, we'd be more than happy to. And if you'd like to present something specifically on banks and something specifically on ESG, if that would be helpful to the committee, we'd be more than happy to do that and to discuss with Jane how that would be best presented. And if that's something else that you'd like to look at, these are things that we've done in the past and are more than happy to do for North East Derbyshire.
I think the committee would welcome that. It gives us more information. So I think that would be extremely welcome, as I said. And the committee always expect to have additional reports called for in our agenda. So there's always space for another one. Councillor Kerry, I'm just conscious, have you got a question that you want to ask? I'm just conscious that you're not on screen.
Not at this stage, Martin. You could ask Nicola Carver if you would please to unblock me video so I can try and get back on the screen.
That's done for you now, Councillor Kerry.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that's it then for Mr. Kitching and Mr. Roberts. Thank you very much for illuminating us with your presentation today and your attendance. So you can depart. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor. And thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much, Councillors.
Cheers. Thanks. Right.
So item 5 then, report of internal audit consortium manager. So over to Jenny for the business continuity maintaining financial control report.
Thank you, Chair. So at the last committee meeting, the committee requested a report on business continuity, specifically in relation to maintaining financial control. So hopefully this report provides members with some assurance that the council has got appropriate governance and financial arrangements in place to be able to maintain financial control. Attached to the report at Appendix 1 is a review that we undertook of council's compliance with the CIPFA Financial Management Code. So CIPFA published this code in 2019, and the aim of the code is to provide guidance for good and sustainable financial management. It's split into 6 key principles, which cover leadership, accountability, transparency, standards, assurance, and sustainability. The code doesn't dictate how you actually demonstrate those principles, but it gives some ideas and thoughts to the sort of things they would expect to be in place. So we had a look at those, and our review concluded that the council does demonstrate good compliance with those areas, which helps to demonstrate financial sustainability. Another aspect is that we do review the council's main financial systems on a very regular basis. And as you can see from the report, all of those have received substantial assurance in recent years, which is a very good indicator that the controls are in place and they're running appropriately. External auditors haven't raised any concerns, and the 1920 accounts have been signed off, and a statement that appropriate value for money systems are in place. And lastly, Appendix 2 looks at the financial areas of the recovery plans, and there weren't any issues identified or concerns there. So in conclusion, it is a very difficult financial time for councils, and there are challenges in place, as I'm sure you're aware. But I think hopefully the report demonstrates that North East Derbyshire Council has got effective systems and processes in place that will help them to cope with those financial challenges. And I'm happy to try and answer any questions. Thank you.
Questions? I've just got one, which is with regard to recommendation 2, which is about benchmarking arrangements. Why is that down as a low priority when benchmarking arrangements and a methodology that actually helps us to look at how we're performing against other benchmarked authorities and so on is actually a helpful way of determining how we're doing? I didn't get why that's a low priority.
I think it's because Jane and her section already do undertake some sort of informal benchmarking. CITFA do have a financial resilience benchmarking, but from what I understand, it didn't really work last year. The authorities weren't comparing like with like. I think they've made some improvements this year, whereas I think one of the issues was different councils call reserves slightly different things, and the benchmarking that CITFA undertook was kicking out some perhaps strange results. And I know Jane brought a report to the committee last meeting, I think, looking at some benchmarking, and that it is something that Jane keeps an eye on. So I'm confident that finance do look at that, and will continually look at ways to benchmark with other councils.
If I may then, in response to that, I think the fact that the methodology has not been consistent across authorities over a period of time, it hasn't been while I've been a councillor, and I'm coming up to 20 years. And the fact that we still have this problem because of the ways that council deal with their own budgets or vocabulary use or whatever, would say to me that we still need to work out a system. And yes, last time, the last meeting, we did have benchmarking, which was extremely useful. I thought it was a good way of actually indicating how this council was doing, and it'll be something I'm sure most people will be continuing to talk about. So the fact we've only just started down this pathway of benchmarking in the way that I would hope, I would have probably asked that the priority was not low, that it was actually moved to medium, but I'm just going to ask the Section 151 officer for a comment.
I have no objection with that, Chair. If you feel it should be medium, you're absolutely right. Benchmarking is only a can opener. It's always.
I think you're on mute.
Oh, am I? Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yes.
Oh, it's got you. You're muted on there.
Yeah. I'm operating a two-way system, so I've got. You can see me on my laptop, but I'm talking through the chamber, so it's a little bit strange. Sorry about that.
No, sorry.
So yeah, it is. Benchmarking, I always find, is a bit of a can opener. So it's a great start point, but then you always have to delve into the detail because there's just so much inconsistency otherwise. So more than happy to do more of it for the committee if that's what you'd like us to do. I thought it was quite a useful exercise too last time, Chair.
Let's open that can then.
Yes.
It's not an exact science, but at least it helps us. So we'll move that priority to medium, please.
Yes, I'm happy to move the priority to medium. I mean, we do try and look at it from a risk basis, and I guess is there a risk of not undertaking detailed benchmarking? And I guess we'd perhaps argue that there's other mitigating factors that the governance arrangements in place. But I take on board your point, and we'll move that up to a medium.
Thank you. Are there any other comments or questions? No, thank you. It's a very comprehensive report. Thank you. So we move to the recommendation that the report be noted. Do we have a proposal for that, please? Councillor Clough, seconded by Councillor Shipman. All in favour? Thank you. That's carried. Thank you. So we move to item 6 then. These are reports from the Head of Finance and Resources and Section 151 Officer. 6A, Money Laundering Policy Refresh. Over to you, please, Jane.
Thank you, Chair. You'll have all seen this policy in the past, and it simply is just a refresh. So I'm not proposing to go into any detail over it because it's not the most exciting of reports. it's just basically been updated for changes in legislation. There's no change to our operations or our policies whatsoever within it. So I'll take any questions if there are, rather than go through the detail.
Any comments or questions on the policy refresh? Councillor Shipman?
Can you go through the three highlights?
Really?
Well, I'm just has there been anything major? Or are we talking like they've removed the word "the" from a policy, and like
Yeah.
what have they done?
It's literally, we're obligated to refresh them every so many years. So we refresh them every so many years, and literally that is the extent of the change. I'm obligated to bring it to the committee every 3 years, I believe. So there is no change.
I'll propose that we notice.
See, that glass of milk has done you the world of good. So a proposal then from Councillor Shipman. Do we have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Armitage. All in favour? Thank you. That is carried. Then item B, Treasury Management. Over to you, please, Jane.
Thank you, Chair. You've probably heard enough of Treasury Management this afternoon. So again, I'm not proposing to go through these reports in any detail. They are the annual reports that come to the committee every year prior to going to council for approval in February. So you will have the Treasury Management strategy that deals with the cash investments, and that's largely what Arlingclose have just been talking to you about. You will have the investment strategy that deals with our investments. Now, these are what are called service investments. So these fall into the category of service delivery for that table that Stephen just showed you. So we can still borrow from the PWLB. Stephen was right to raise that. That is going to be hugely challenging for councils going forward, especially those that have got more ambitious plans to basically cover off their budget deficits by doing something a little bit more creative. And then the final one is the capital strategy, which details our plans for the capital programme for the coming years and how we're going to finance them. So happy to take any questions, Chair.
Councillor Barker.
Can't find my mouse under all my papers. I'm lost. It's just for clarity, really. I'm not trying to catch you out at all, Jane. I've just read through some of this. On page 60, that table 1, the middle thing, less external borrowing, and it's got the 2 stars. Have you got it? Can you? Are you aware of what
I'm just scrolling through
talking
now.
about?
Yep, I've got it.
It says shows only loans to which the council is committed and excludes optional refinancing. What does that mean?
Yeah, basically what that's talking about, it's the loans that we've actually taken out at the moment. So what that would mean is when Stephen just showed you that table that showed that the borrowing drops off after so many years, I think it was 14 years when the big debt drops off. Yeah. What we'll probably do with most of that, because it's HRA borrowing and we're still going to have the houses, we'll probably refinance that at that rate. So that's what it's talking about. It's talking about us moving forward with refinancing and not, it's talking about what loans we've got at the moment in simple terms.
Right. It was just the refinancing bit.
Yeah.
And I think I'd also got a note on the next page, 1.22, liability benchmark against alternative strategy. And I just wondered how that, like we've talked about benchmarking, how does that work?
Yeah, and this is very much about comparing our borrowing against if we did something different. Now, the problem with these benchmarking statistics are that they're very rigid, so they don't allow a lot of room for manoeuvre within them. And we do very little other than either use our reserves or borrow. So this would be, if you took, for example, you may want to do some leasing or something like that instead. So it would be if you've got an alternative strategy to your existing capital strategy, which ours is borrowing or using reserves, how would it measure up? But because we haven't really got any alternatives, it's very bland, and it's just literally about using our reserves, our working capital, which is that cash that was in that table, the 26 million, or borrow. So these indicators aren't that user friendly, I have to be honest. We're just required to publish them.
Right. And the other one on the borrowing strategy, which you've answered, and I'll stand corrected that it went. I've just looked at the papers that I'd paid. It don't say public loan board. It just says borrowing. So I was wrong. Sorry. I apologise for that. I was going to ask on that question where, there's no borrowing, but therefore we borrowed it off ourselves, I take it. That's covered that one. I think that's
I'll
That's
ask
more
Nick.
or less me on. I'm just being pedantic, I suppose. Martin, on that. But
No, it's all right. And thank you for your apology. I look forward to the letter, the apology in it as well. So I'll just ask Jane to respond to that as well, please.
It's confusing for us. It is very, very difficult when we make a decision to put something in the capital programme. We always work on the premise of borrowing, and I use the term borrowing loosely because it can be internal borrowing or PWLB borrowing, because what we want to do is make sure that we're being prudent and we've got the worst case scenario in there should we need to borrow in the future. So that way we're building in the revenue costs for minimum revenue provision, interest, payback, all of that sort of thing into our decision making. So it's a prudent decision, really. That's why we do it.
I just got one more, Martin. Sorry, I've just seen my other notes on 1.59 investment limits. I've just made a note that the council revenue reserves available to cover investment losses are forecast to be 17.9 million. How does that? I don't understand that. Where's that 17.9 million come?
17.9 million is what we'll expect to put on our balance sheet at the end of this financial year. So it is a forecast at this stage, but it's not far out normally. So when we produce our accounts at the end of the year and we pull the balance sheet together, we'd expect to have 17.9 million available within our investments to be able to utilise. We can't actually physically use it because it's tied up, so it'll be tied up in market funds, etc., etc. But it's pretty much it's equivalent to the 20 million that Arlingclose were just talking about. I think their figures.
That's where I'm getting confused, because that 17 didn't match up with what you were saying.
No, you're absolutely right. It doesn't match up. Our figures are more up to date than their figures, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. My question is basically around caveats, because we're asked to look at a suite of strategies going through to 2024, 2025. And we know that, of course, there's lots of external things that may happen that could influence outcomes. For example, you've got at 1.10 a selection of external influences that include COVID, and we don't know how things will go from here in the pandemic in the long term. But we've also got in there the exit from the EU and what that might look like, and President Biden from today and how that might impact on things. So I think there's a range of things you can't even forecast, and maybe we can't even second guess the impact on some of those things, as well as the ones that we don't know about. So I think it's difficult to try and talk about a strategy going that far ahead when we've just heard from Arlingclose that perhaps we need to look at one or two things, including the bank risk and bail-in and ring fencing. So how are we going to just amend this report, perhaps to put some caveats in, or slightly amend the report for full council that includes some of the things that we might look at as a result of the advice we've had today?
Yeah, absolutely, Chair. We can do that. We can. It is always very hard to forecast beyond 1 year. That's why, to a large extent, when we do the MTFP, we set the budget for 1 year, and then the rest is just financial plan. And the Treasury strategies are exactly the same. The only certainty really is in the current year, and even then, there are still some uncertainties within there. So more than happy to reference that in the council report. If the agenda's not already gone, I'll be looking at Nikki for some guidance on that.
Yeah, I'm hoping it hasn't gone out, because I think we do need to just slightly amend the Treasury strategy in light of what we've heard today. I've seen you, Councillor Shipman. I'll just ask Nikki to just answer this.
So in regard to the council agenda, it's all prepped to go out. It'll be going out at 9 AM tomorrow morning.
You said agenda. Do you mean this paper as well?
Yes, I do mean that paper.
What if we rejected it?
There is a statement at the top of the report which says that it's subject to amendments that will be given verbally at the meeting. Right.
Well, we could circulate an amendment. I think that's what we'll do. Councillor Shipman.
Given that we can't amend this strategy, apparently, might this be the perfect time to emphasise the not investing in unethical people and organisations in the fossil fuel industry to advise them with climate net zero that we've approved already? Because to me, this is the document that we're talking about, right? It has to be something that's written down for officers to follow and to make sure that we're doing it.
Yeah, I think we ought to amend the report. I know Nick is now going to have a sleepless night, and I hope not. But what we could do is say that this report, the agenda stays the same, the agenda item stays the same, but the report could be forwarded on from after the amendments are made. So report to follow. So when we're amending the report to put in some additional considerations for external influencing, for example, and some of the caveats and some of the Arlingclose things. For example, the thing that Arlingclose talked to us today about ethical stance, we could reference the fact that this audit committee is actually going to receive further information to look at strategies with ethics included and so on, and we can reference it in this report without going into detail because we haven't decided it yet. Would that be acceptable to you, Councillor Shipman?
Yeah.
Right, you sound not so sure, or the fact that I'm asking you is bewildering.
Well, when would it be decided? Sorry if I just missed that in what you were saying.
Yeah, because what we've decided is the ethical paper is going to come back to a future audit committee. So this is going out to full council on the 1st of February. We won't have decided it by then, or how it might look, or what sort of considerations there'll have been. So I think if we reference it in this report that goes to full council, the detail will follow, because we will have discussed it at our next audit committee or one after that. Have I clarified it?
Yeah, that makes sense. So are we adding like an extra bullet point on one of the recommendations that say the council will follow ethical guidance, which will be approved at a later, whatever?
Yeah, we're going to consider how we invest ethically and so on, and that the audit committee will be looking at that. Nikki,
I'll propose that amendment then, Chair.
Thank you. Nikki, so you get where we're going with this?
I do. I'm just talking to Jane or Desik on the chat just to confirm that what we can do rather than just delay the dispatch of this item, that we'll get the revised report ready to go out with the dispatch.
Excellent. So that's your night ruined. So, okay, Jane, do you want to come back on that?
Thank you, Chair. So can I just clarify what we're actually amending? We're amending the recommendations to include a caveat to reflect the external influences and the future development of some ethical funding and financing.
Yeah, and that we are going to look at the bank risk and bail-in and ring fencing situation.
That's fine. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thank you. Anything from anybody else? I think if Councillor Barker, over to you.
I've got it. Just on the, I've removed off the financial strategy, the capital strategy.
Yeah, carry on.
Just one question on that. On page 78, 1.12, asset disposals, where they're talking with £4.5 million of capital receipts in the coming financial year. That seems a lot. I just wonder where that were coming from.
That's council housing, as you'd expect, and it's also got some of the investment that we're expecting to get back as capital receipts from Northwood Group.
Oh, are we going to start getting some back from that?
I hope so, Councillor Barker. The capital plan's relying on it.
Oh, it just sounds a lot.
It is.
We'll cross his fingers.
That would be back. Yeah, that's what it is.
Yeah. Okay. That's fine. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, any other comments, questions? If not, can we move to recommendations then at 6.1? Report with the amendments made.
I'll move, Chair.
Please. Thank you, Councillor Shipman. Do you have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Clough. All in favour? Thank you. That is carried. Thank you. And then medium-term financial plan. Over to you.
Thank you, Chair. As you'll all be aware, it's been a hugely challenging budget setting process this year with the pandemic. We've had a lot of uncertainty over our own budgets, and we've also had a lot of uncertainty over the national settlement, which we actually got on the 17th of December. The good news was that nothing major was done in the settlement, and it was just a rollover of last year's settlement, which was a rollover of the previous year's settlement. So we're now in year 6 of the 4-year settlement from 2015. What it also included was a series of measures that were targeted specifically at addressing issues that the council have been facing with regards to COVID. So it included some support around collection fund losses, which, as I'm sure you'll appreciate, we're suffering quite significant losses in income on the collection fund in relation to council tax and business rates. And what this process will do is it will allow us to spread those losses over the next 3 years rather than us taking that hit all in 1 year, which would ultimately hit our general funds. There's also some support for councils where the tax base, in effect, where the ability to levy council tax and business rates has been reduced as a result of the pandemic. And that's happened because of higher numbers of either council tax support on the council tax side or appeals on the business rate side. And it means that we actually can't collect as much as we would like to. So there's some support being put in place there as well. The income compensation scheme for lost fees and charges, that's continuing into Q1 of 21-22, which is a huge help for our leisure services. And we're expecting to get one more tranche of COVID grant to ease financial pressures into next year as well. The indicative figure is 491,000. That's yet to be confirmed yet because the settlement is still provisional at the moment. We're also getting a one-off lower tier services grant, which is 205,000, which was unexpected. Again, that's to help with the delivery of the ongoing services because of the pandemic. So what it means in a nutshell is that setting the budget this year was nowhere near as challenging as we initially thought it was going to be, because all of the things that we thought were going to come out, such as new homes bonus and the business rates reform and the fair funding review, didn't happen. We're now expecting all of those to happen in the new year, 2022. So what we've done effectively is pushed all of those budget pressures back a year. So what that means is we've been able to set a balanced general fund budget for 21-22 with a very, very small deficit of 133,000, which I'm expecting to be able to cover off with efficiency savings of vacancies throughout the year. So as you'll be aware, council tax increases in the past, there's been a national barrier on what we can actually charge. Sorry for clutching around for the right word there. It's set at 1.99% or £5, exactly the same as in previous years. There's an increasing reliance on the system, on the current funding system for councils. There's an increasing reliance on councils to collect the money that they need to meet the cost of their services from local taxation and from council tax. But that's very difficult for local politicians because you've got to also balance that up against the need and the impact on your taxpayers. So this year, members are proposing to council an increase of 1.95%. Just moving on to the HRA, there's no real major budget pressures in the HRA this year. The HRA has been relatively insulated from COVID and has not suffered the upsets that the general funds suffered so far. So we've not really got any budget pressures identified in the HRA. Rents are being increased by 1.5% this year, which is in line with rent guidance, and then they will be reviewed annually thereon in. We're not taking a decision to review rents for future years. It's just this year that Cabinet are going to recommend to Council a 1.5% increase. We've engaged with Ricknord Homes over their management fee, and they've agreed that they will cash limit their management fee in the same way that the general fund budgets are cash limited, and so a fee of 9.692 million has been proposed for approval. And in terms of the capital programme, which you'll be able to see at Appendix 4, for the general fund, the highlights in there are that there's refurbishment costs for Kilmarsh Leisure Centre, and the vehicle replacement programme increases from 2022. The vehicle replacement programme, you'll be aware, does fluctuate depending on what we have to replace. We don't just replace the vehicles because the programme says so. We try and push them out as long as we can and make them last as long as we can. So that will probably decrease again in future years. And in terms of the HRA, and this is exactly what Stephen and Paul were saying from Arlingclose earlier, is we've taken a decision this year to pull forward £7 million to do some additional eco works on the non-trad properties. You'll all be aware that we've got a high proportion of non-trad properties within our stock, and an opportunity has arisen to be able to draw down some grant funding to be able to do a lot more work on those properties. So we were planning to do this in future years anyway. What we've decided to do is pull that money forward because we can lever in some grant funding. I think we can draw down about £1 million, which is really, really good news. And I'm happy to take any questions. I won't go through the detail because I know you all will, and I'll have lots of questions for me, so I'm happy to move to the questions at that point, Chair.
Any questions? Councillor Barker.
Thank you. Again, it's. I don't think we've got many options, to be honest. I'm not going to make any grandstanding or anything like that. Just again for my benefit, Jane, on page 6 or page 105, I think is better. On the reserves, and it mentions how much we've got a working balance of 2 million and an investor save of 2.7, and then on the next bullet point 1.27, that we've took some money 1.2 million out of resilient reserves. That's the first time I've heard that, resilience reserve. How many reserves have we got?
We've got quite a lot. We've got quite a lot of reserves, but you're absolutely right. The resilience reserve is a new one that we established last year. Completely fortuitously, it was established to deal with the potential shortfalls in new homes bonus that we expected and business rates. So we decided that instead of just having the investor save pot, which was all about reinvesting, spending to make another pound, we also maybe needed something to protect against losses. And so the resilience reserve was created last year to protect against those very losses. As it's happened, what we've used it for in actual fact is to put the COVID money in there, the COVID grants that we've been receiving from the government. So what I've been doing is I've been putting the COVID grants into the resilience reserve, and then I'm going to be paying out of the resilience reserve to protect against the costs or the incomes more specifically, particularly leisure, to protect those services against the losses that they're facing because of COVID. So I probably ought to call it the resilience reserve brackets COVID this year, because that's pretty much what it is.
Okay, it was just, I suppose I were being a bit sarcastic, but it's what Pat we used to call it, the back pocket one that we never seem to know about. You just have just magic all of a sudden, a bit of money appears. But generally, all right with it, we're okay this year. But if you look at the overriding thing going forward, 24, 25, £2.5 million, we're not in a good place, particularly, are we? Let's be honest.
No.
But we're where we are. It is what it is, as they say.
Yeah. Councillor Shipman.
I will talk about the elephant in the room, but given how dire it looked, why are we looking at Kilmarsh Sports Centre?
Yeah.
Okay, this is a different.
That is the elephant in the room, Ross. I didn't like bringing it up.
The elephant in the room is Kilmarsh Leisure Centre. Okay, I'm just going to talk about this from a financial perspective, because that was a political decision taken by Cabinet. So I just, advise Cabinet on the financial position, and then Cabinet make a decision. In terms of the MTFP, for the first 3 years, it doesn't hit the MTFP that significantly because of the cushion, the I can't remember what they've called it, they've used some fancy name for it, but the subsidy that Kilmarsh Parish Council are going to give the council, the district council.
If Councillor Clough needs to declare an interest,
yes,
and might need to leave the room.
Councillor Clough, you may just need to, yes, that's a very good point, Chair.
And just a reminder to members that we're actually in open session currently.
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't here at the start. Yeah, I do need to declare an interest in this now. We're discussing Kilmarsh, and I'm happy to leave the room at this moment.
What's the legalities, Nikki, on this? I've just thought on that. Is the illegal aspect? Were it confidential or whatever?
Yeah, so this is the confidential item that you discussed at the last meeting of council. So obviously the conversations that took place therein are still confidential.
Yeah. It is worth pointing out that the district council have announced that they are investing this money in Kilmarsh Sports, or there's talks ongoing, should I say?
I think before we go any further, I think Councillor Clough does need to be put in a room. So could you do that first?
Yeah. Are you happy for me to do that for you, Councillor Clough, to withdraw you?
Thank you, Councillor Clough.
And Chair, your discretion, if you do feel that the conversation is starting to move in
I'm happy for the conversation to happen. If we start to move into perhaps areas we shouldn't, then we'll stop it there. But let's have the conversation and see where we go. So back to you, Jane.
Yes, we were talking about the finances, which is in the MTFP report, which will be a public report that goes to council for you all to decide on. So in terms of the finances, I think I'll take Nikki's advice, but I think we're okay to continue at this stage. Yeah. So within the MTFP, the parish council are subsidising the district council for the first 3 years to the sums that were described in the previous report. I'm not going to identify those because they may be subject to the privacy of the previous report, but it does mean that the burden on the general fund for the first few years is minimal. Going on longer term, it does become more of a burden to us, but that's when our leisure services team are hopeful that they will have been able to improve the facility and improve the income generation so that that won't be such a burden. But that's why arrangements, and I'm having to tread very carefully here, arrangements will be put in place to protect both organisations. I'd probably not rather go further than that in open session.
You've trod that pathway very nicely. It is public knowledge, and one way because an announcement has been made. So I think the public are aware. Could debate and we could discuss and we could agree or whatever. But from an audit point of view, we're looking at the financial side of it and the decision-making process and where we go from here. Because I think the audit committee also has a role to play in scrutinising the finances of it going forward. And I think we should. But not just the Killamarsh one, all leisure centres as well. So I think we can agree that that's on our forward plan for the audit committee. Councillor Shipman?
Chair, will we be seeing the contents of the arrangement once it's been done so we can scrutinise it before it goes to council?
Yeah, Nikki?
Can I just clarify what Councillor Shipman is asking for?
Well, presumably there's going to be an arrangement that's going to be drawn up at some point about how that whole arrangement is going to be governed, who's going to be paying what, and you know, I think it's probably our role to see that before it's signed, sealed, delivered, and we've not had chance to scrutinise it.
You may want to make a resolution then that you're requesting pre-scrutiny of that item of business.
Do we do that here, full council?
You can do that. As I believe that should be, Jane will correct me, that should be within the remit of this committee if you'd like to request pre-scrutiny. It can also go through to the scrutiny officer. Obviously, he's not in attendance currently, and she could always reallocate that to a different scrutiny committee if appropriate.
Jane?
Yeah, that sounds right to me, Nikki. Yeah.
In that case, can I propose? Can I
I
propose
think,
that we
I think
see
you
this?
found yourself a seconder already. So it's been proposed by Councillor Shipman then and seconded by Councillor Barker that we do have.
I won't really second, though I will second it, but I would just put my hand up just to clarify that is it right for it to come to this committee or another scrutiny committee? Is what you're advising? Because I think it's just about the management arrangements or what it's not so much the financial bit because that's been decided. It's how. What do you call it?
I think that's a good question. I think we're all sort of in principle understanding that pre-scrutiny would be welcome. Yes. It's which scrutiny it goes before. If it's the financial case, that's one thing for this committee, but the actual delivery of it and the management of the centre, so to speak, might be best in another committee.
Yeah.
No, I'm definitely talking about the financial arrangement.
Okay.
And the deal that's been agreed.
Yeah. I'm happy to second that then, that we have a pre-scrutiny. I don't know how we do that, Nikki, but I'll seconded what Ross has just said, I think.
Nikki?
So we can build that into the forward plans for this meeting and also build that into the timescales where it's going to go through to other bodies such as Cabinet or Council, just to make sure that we build in that timescale. I would have thought if you're looking at the governance and finance arrangements that would sit within the remit of this committee. If for any reason it verged onto the leisure services aspect of that would sit under community scrutiny.
And then perhaps we need the Cabinet member responsible and the officer responsible for that decision making to outline the decision making process for the committee.
So the team have noted that today, and that'll appear in your minutes. And also I've noted that to make sure that that's planned in correctly. Is the committee agreeing? It's been proposed and seconded. Do we have an alternative, or are we all happy with that? All in favour?
Yeah, that's carried unanimously. Thank you. Can we not talk about Killamarsh now and readmit Councillor Clough?
Yes, Chair, I'll just get him back in.
Okay, thank you. Welcome back. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Anything else on the report? Mine was only a small one, about 1.48, which is about the 1.49, sorry, about parking solutions. We'd set aside 288,000 per annum. So to come to that figure, which seemed a bit random, we must have an outline of the car parking solutions and where they're going to be.
I believe there is, Chair. That's with our colleagues at Ricknord Homes, so I'll confer with them and ask them to speak to you about that.
Yeah, thank you, because it would be nice to know where, because I know I did see an outline one, then nothing ever materialised. I'm sure all ward members would like to know where they are and where starting and who's next and so on.
I'd missed that one, Martin. Well done.
Well, thank you. No, I shall accept your apology in writing. Thank you. And I also welcome the fact that this report has come to us before Cabinet on the 28th of January. Thank you. That's really good. So can we move to recommendation 6.1? Do we have a proposer, please? Thank you, Councillor Armitage. Do we have a seconder? Councillor Shipman, thank you. All in favour? Thank you, that's carried. So move to item 7, forward plan. Anything that you want to say, Jane, on the forward plan? I think we've already added some things of our own.
No, thank you, Chair. I think between me, Nikki and Damon, we'll add the items that you've raised and we'll make sure that they get on for next time. I've got nothing further to add if Nikki or Damon hasn't.
Anything from governance?
Not from me, Chair.
No, I'm sure you've got a record of everything we've said today, which has given you a list as long as your arm. Thank you. Anything else anybody wants to add to our forward plan that we haven't mentioned today? If not, move to item 8 then, to consider any items which the chairs of the opinion should be considered as a matter of urgency. I don't have any. So item 9, the date and time of next meeting is 10th of February at 3 o'clock. Can I thank you very much for your attendance and declare the meeting closed? Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.